Welcome to the southern border of Hungary, which is also the European Union's southern border. Who controls the border controls the future. That's the unspoken truth politicians on both sides of the Atlantic have spent decades trying to ignore. And now, the reckoning has arrived. From Texas to Dover, from Lampedusa to Ruska, the West is experiencing what happens when you outsource national integrity to short-term sentiment and supranational daydreams. The human smugglers aren't just desperate, they're disciplined, organized, and better funded than ever. 10 years ago, Hungary stood alone within the European Union in calling for the closure of borders and a firm response to illegal migration. Today, however, parties across Europe that oppose illegal immigration are gaining ground, transforming migration into a defining campaign issue across the continent. No political force can now afford to remain silent on border security or the tightening of deportation policies. Voters are demanding answers on both sides of the Atlantic, and they are placing their trust in those who are willing to provide them. The rise of no-go zones, social tensions, terror attacks, the visible decline in public safety, and the growing fear permeating people's daily lives have all become part of everyday conversation. It has become painfully evident that Europe's freedom and sovereignty will not endure if it continues down the path of cultural and political abdication. Whether openly acknowledged or reluctantly confronted, the romantic ideals of Willkommenskultur are being reassessed. We are living through a moment of reckoning, a deep political and intellectual shift. And across Europe, the people are no longer whispering their discontent. They are demanding change. Borders are not just lines on a map. They are lines of meaning, memory, and survival. Borders, sovereignty, and the price of looking away. This time on View from the Danube. Hello, welcome to View from the Danube. I'm Rod Dreher. I'm joined today by Matthew Goodwin, who comes to us from the UK, from the University of Buckingham, and is a well-known commentator, particularly on cultural and migration issues. István Kiss, the executive director of the Danube Institute, and Michael O'Shea, a visiting fellow here at the Danube Institute. Welcome, gentlemen. Let's jump right in. We'll talk about migration, your favorite topic. Since January 2025, the Trump administration has promised record deportations, and he's actually been getting it done, although it's moved a lot more slowly than many of us would have liked. What's going on in the UK right now with the migration scene? You published on your Substack, great Substack everyone should subscribe to, some pretty shocking numbers.
Well, I think there are lots of people in the UK who would like to see Trump-style deportations, but they're not going to see them anytime soon. We have two things going on. One is an illegal migration crisis with the small boats crossing from France, so 160,000 plus, mainly young men from Islamic countries have been crossing into the UK, which has been generating considerable alarm. But actually the bigger problem is our legal migration crisis. We now have a new net migration rate of 431,000 people coming into the country. More are coming than leaving, 431,000.
Polish plumbers, Ukrainians, right?
Very little of that is from Europe. 81% of all migration into the UK is now from outside of Europe. 1 in every 25 people in the UK today arrived in the last 4 years. This is a legacy of Boris Johnson's mass migration experiment. And are they high-skilled workers? Well, here's one stat everybody needs to know. Of the 3.5 million people who came into the UK in recent years, the percentage who came mainly to work on work visas was 14%.
14%.
14%. So the rest are the relatives of workers, students, the relatives of students, illegal migrants, asylum seekers, and so on. So, you know, this is why the Brits are so utterly frustrated. They don't have control of their borders. They've got a model of mass migration that's making them poorer. Nobody actually voted for this, and nobody in government can tell them why this is a good idea, because all of the evidence shows quite clearly it's not. It's making us poorer, it's driving up crime, and is making our society much weaker and more divided. So that's basically the migration story in the UK.
But Matthew, Prime Minister Keir Starmer recently did an about-face on migration, right? Now he's getting tough on migration, or so Number 10 says.
So what you have in the UK is a very interesting situation whereby the Labour leadership are openly gaslighting the country. They're saying we're getting the numbers down. There was a fall in net migration, but that was because of reforms introduced in the last days of the previous government. Nothing the Labour government has done has brought net migration down. It's still 100,000 than it was at the time of Brexit. It's about 80% higher than the average in the 2010s. It's about 7 times higher than it was before Tony Blair kicked all of this off in 2004. So the Labour government are gaslighting the British people, saying we've got control, the numbers are coming down. In reality, they've liberalised migration even more. They're refusing to do things that we need to do to control the borders, like leave the European Convention on Human Rights. They're actively incentivising people to cross illegally because they've expanded the use of hotels and private accommodation for illegal migrants. So, you know, all of this is accumulating, building up costs for the UK taxpayer, which, again, nobody ever wanted to see. Nobody voted for this. So for the first time in my life, I'm genuinely concerned, actually, about the direction of travel in the UK.
István, we don't have these problems in Hungary. We have problems, but not this one. Why not?
Well, I think it's really, I mean, you know, you have obvious reasons that Hungary is luckily not really a country which is a destination for migrants because of obvious reasons. I mean, historically, Hungary didn't have colonies, so you don't have that kind of colonial route, but also we're, I mean, to be very honest, economically still more underdeveloped than, let's say, Western Europe. So you have these kind of obvious reasons. But I think what is really an important factor, because Misha perhaps can talk about Poland a bit later. So if you see a lot of the Visegrad countries which are on similar economic terms with Hungary and even Romania, migration has been growing. And in Hungary, it's not really the case. So I think there's a kind of a shift in attitudes. I think what works and what is shown to be working, I think, partly in America now, but also with Tony Abbott in Australia and with Orban here in Hungary, is if you have a very strong stance on migration. So you say, we are fighting illegal migration and we're trying to do actual policies against this. So, for example, the border fence, which is really a fence. So it's not, as Tucker Carlson said, it's not like some high-tech, huge concrete wall or something like that.
Border fence between Hungary and Serbia.
And Serbia, yes. Which I think sends a very strong message that if you want to try to come in illegally, it's not going to be possible. And also some of the policies that actually, if you catch some of these people in Hungary during routine inspections, then if you don't have the proper papers, so you don't have an ID card, you don't have the papers which would show you're an actual asylum seeker, so it turns out you're here illegally, they basically take you down to the border and let you into Serbia. So there's a lot of kind of a tough approach to migration, which I think other countries should adopt. So it's not, I think we have this kind of defeatist attitude in a lot of the European countries that, oh, I mean, you cannot really do anything about migration. You know, these people are poor, they will just come. I think that's wrong. You could. And Hungary shows that it is possible if you have tough policies. And the same with Australia. I think Tony Abbott, he had this very powerful message.
Former Prime Minister
of Australia. But if you try to come into Australia illegally, you will not be able to come in legally. I think that's a very strong message, which I think all European countries should adopt, because I think that kind of disincentivizes some of these people to come here. Because if you kind of risk the chance of coming in later on legally or staying there legally, then that's a very, you know, kind of significant risk. But even here in Hungary, a big problem was, which has been mentioned, is basically the European courts. We have still a European Court of Justice because we're EU members. Luckily, you don't have that anymore. But you still have the European Human Rights Court, which is very similar. which has been constantly attacking, not just in Hungary, but of course in the UK, in Italy, other places, kind of strong stances on migration policies. And Hungary, even now, is actually paying money, fines to the European Union because of its migration system, because they say it's against European Union law. But we kind of said, okay, I mean, we don't want more illegal migration. We think our system is working, so we will just pay the fine. I mean, it's not a good system, but we're doing it. A lot of countries shy away. They say we don't want to have these debates with the European Court of Justice or the European Human Rights Court. Hungary was kind of more tough. But even with this, we had regularly interferences from judges, from courts, which I think is kind of a general Western problem in America as well, but especially in Europe, that you have a lot of these courts, judges who make these decisions, and then basically governments just flop or use it as convenient excuses to not do anything because, oh, we cannot do anything. The European Human Rights Court said that it's against European rights or something. So I think we have to think about that, what to do with this, because it is really a kind of a block. But also I think in the end, governments should be more brave and kind of confident in doing these measures, because if you look in all the countries, actually in Hungary, it's fairly low. If you look at even the European polls, if people want to have more migration, in Hungary it's like 50-something% says no more migration. You have countries like Germany, France, where it's over 80%, and these are the the official European statistics.
But nothing happened.
But nothing happens. As this has been going on for like a decade. Poll after poll shows that huge majorities of people in Europe say they don't want more migration, and their governments are completely ignoring that. Sadly, the British Conservatives were like this as well.
We'll come back to that. Michael O'Shea, you live in Poland. What is the situation there? I mean, the Polish economy is booming, seems to me. How do people in Poland feel about migration and what's happening?
I'm a Polish citizen, but at the moment I'm in the U.S. But go to Warsaw, go to any of the big Polish cities, and you'll perceive that this is a wealthy country now. It's booming. It truly is. But you'll also perceive some of the elements that are happening in Western Europe, where the young men are loitering outside of the train stations and on the street corners.
Young migrants.
Yeah, random acts of violence that are popping up in the Polish headlines that never happened before. So to get into the views of the people, you have the left coalition, which is the leftmost element of the current ruling government. And among those voters, people are split roughly 50-50 on migration. And among all other important coalitions in the Polish political ecosystem, people are firmly against it. Tusk supporters are firmly against it.
Prime Minister Donald Tusk.
Yes, Donald Tusk. So it's the classic conflict between liberalism and democracy. If democratic interests prevailed, there would not be migration into Poland. Generally, people are not opposed to the migrants who have been coming from Ukraine and Belarus. They're culturally similar, linguistically, pretty similar, and the people fit in quite well. So you've had over 1 million refugees from the Ukraine war who have come to Poland, and that's really not controversial. So it's important to distinguish the NGO-driven migration from Africa and the Middle East, and also the economic, if you want to call it that, migration to fill food delivery jobs and Uber driver jobs, often from the subcontinent. I think those three forms are important to categorize differently.
Well, I have to wonder. Let me back up a little. I went to the European Parliament last week, my first time there, and it just seemed like such an island of unreality about realities of politics, migration, all kinds of politics in Europe. And I met there a German friend. I'd last seen her 2 years ago. She's a Christian Democrat, and she's not a member of the European Parliament. She's an activist. And I said, 2 years ago, you warned me about the AfD, the Alliance for Germany, the populist party. You said, I'm conservative, but I'm worried about some elements there. Do you still feel that way? She said, not at all. She said, even though I am concerned about some parts of the AfD, my country is in such crisis now. The only possible political hope we have is AfD coming into government. And she said that since the election in Germany earlier this year, the Christian Democratic-led coalition took power. She said Friedrich Merz, the new chancellor, he told everyone he was going to get tough on migration. The minute he was inaugurated, he turned face. She said, now you walk all over Germany and you hear Christian Democratic voters saying, that's it, they've lied to me for the last time. So she predicts an explosion there at the next election. What do you think is going to happen? I mean, in the UK, Nigel Farage and the Reform Party are really just sucking the blood out of the Tories, right?
Well, they're number one in the polls. They're on 30%. They've just become the first party in contemporary British history to win a set of local elections ahead of Labour and the Conservatives, and they're heading for a majority government. But I think across Europe, whether it's the AfD, the Austrian Freedom Party, Giorgia Meloni, Sweden Democrats, I think you see a similar dynamic now playing out, which is, in my mind, it actually started in the 1980s and the 1990s, this growing public resentment towards an elite class that was no longer really putting the interests of their nation state first. And I think that has now been mainstreamed. I think it's entirely normal for members of Gen Z and the millennials who cannot remember the golden age of representative democracy where the mainstream parties were strong and had tribal loyalties and so on, and who, to be frank, are now growing up in this social contract which is rapidly unraveling. I mean, just to go back to a point that was made about allowing illegal migrants to become legal in the system. If you look at the UK at the moment, of all the people that come via the small boats and then apply for asylum, these are illegal migrants applying for asylum. The current Labour government is approving the vast majority of those claims. So the big message that is sending to pretty much everybody else in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Eritrea now is the number one source of people on the boats, is come to the UK because you'll not only have your application approved, come illegally, you'll have it approved. They'll also give you a house. They'll give you welfare, they'll give you a smartphone and a cash card when you arrive. And the complete insanity of all of this, which is now beginning to be realised by younger British people who cannot get on the housing market, is the UK state is now using taxpayers' money to bankroll private companies to give more favourable contracts to landlords who rent their homes out to illegal migrants and to British people. Now imagine that for a second. So the British state is using the British people's money to outbid the British people in the private housing market. Just think about how insane that is.
That can't go on.
That is happening and has been happening for the last 5 or 6 years. So if you're a landlord and you own 10 properties and I'm the state and I come to you and I say, here's a more favourable contract if you take in illegal migrants and asylum seekers. If they make a mess, we'll pay for the repairs. If they don't pay the rent, we'll pay it and we'll pay for the council tax. As a landlord, you're going to say, well, okay, sure, that makes more sense. So who loses in that situation? The British people. But it's their own money that's being used to subsidise this whole experiment. Now, that is making a mockery of the whole idea of what a nation state is supposed to be about.
Ireland too.
Go ahead.
Have you tried to get a hotel in Ireland recently?
Same in Ireland.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the Irish thing is interesting too, because there you see with the Conor McGregor thing and the debate and so forth, the immigration debate is completely reshaping Irish politics.
What is the Conor McGregor thing for our listeners who don't know?
Well, Conor McGregor is obviously a very famous sports person, a UFC fighter who has declared an intention to run for office in Ireland. It's principally on the issue of mass immigration, in the same way that, we have dozens of outsiders and renegades now beginning to also campaign explicitly on that migration issue, because I think the Irish, like the Brits and the English, are fed up of this experiment, which is very visibly failing before our eyes.
István, one of the things that I've noticed as an American who's lived in Hungary the last 4 years is whenever we get somebody here from the UK or Western Europe to visit for a conference or something like that, inevitably after the first day they say, this is not what the media told me Hungary was. And on day 2, some of them will say, Budapest is like what Europe was 30 years ago. Now, we're filming this just near the start of the CPAC conference, CPAC Hungary, where we will have conservatives from all over Europe coming here to Budapest for a couple of days of meetings and speeches, things like that. What do you think that they will see here in Budapest that they can take back home?
Well, I mean, yes, several people say this, that Budapest looks like, let's say, London was 40 years ago or something, or sometimes even a bigger time period. And at first I was like thinking, so it's so run down or, less developed. But luckily it's not. It's just kind of the general feeling that, it looks like the capital of Hungary, and it's safe and it's beautiful and people are relaxed. You can take an evening stroll, even if you're a woman. And sadly, that's not always the case.
And here, women are women.
And that's true as well. Although I did see a couple of transgenders in the couple of past years, but it's not as a big thing as, let's say, in DC or New York or other places. But yeah, that's true. I mean, women are usually women and men are usually men. But I think what Hungary has been trying to portray, because I think what is unique in Hungary is that we have a conservative government which is not shying away of actually implementing conservative ideas into policies. I think this was missing in the UK, in Germany, and several places where you might have, at least in name, conservative governments, but they were lacking conservative policies. And in Hungary, that was the case with migration. Of course, I think the most famous policies are the family support policies, which again is kind of like, I think you have these two kind of competing examples when it comes to migration. I think you have kind of the general Western, which is saying that you cannot really do anything about migration. We have aging populations. So by the way, this is a good thing. We should just have more of them and that will solve our problems. I think this is mostly what Western Europe has been doing in the past 30 years. And I think you have kind of the Eastern Asian version when they say, yes, we have aging populations. I'm not sure what we do with it, but we don't want more migrants. We will use robotics and AI to kind of replace the workforce which we would need. I think this is Japan, South Korea, increasingly China as well. And I think Orban was the only one which said, we don't want mass migration. We want our own people to have more kids. And actually it's possible. Because mostly people don't have more kids because of economic reasons, because they feel that having 2-3 kids is a huge economic burden, and it could be. So, I mean, nobody's disputing that. But they managed to implement a lot of these tax breaks and policies where it's not as much of an economic burden, and actually sometimes it's actually an economic advantage, or at least on a short term. Of course, we can argue how successful this is, but it seems to be fairly successful. We had a huge spike in birth rates, which sadly in the past 2 years went down again, but it's still, if you look at the European average, we are over the average, and before that we were under the average. We were one of the worst countries in Europe with our birth rates. Now we're in the top 3, so there's a big difference. So I think that's also an element. And also another thing I think is that actually under socialist governments, partly it was because the economy was not doing well, but also they had a very relaxed attitude towards crime. So, for example, things which I think are happening in the US, I'm not sure about the UK, but in Hungary as also, they had this kind of idea that petty crimes will not be prosecuted. That basically if you went into a shop, stole like 2 chocolates, then that's not really a crime because you're poor and you had to.
Like something a Soros DA in America would...
Yeah, and this was a case in Hungary. So crime was very prevalent, especially in kind of small cities, villages, where sometimes, poor people were just thinking, I can do this, I can just steal other people's, firewood or something like that because they will not prosecute me. And they changed that completely. So they had a very strong stance on crime. They introduced this policy that if, what they call 3 strikes. So even if you do, kind of petty crimes 3 times, after the third time, you will get a very heavy sentence. So there's a kind of a shift in attitudes towards crime and policing. So I think that's why Hungary became safer. I mean, we don't have migrants, but also with the general population as well.
I'm just laughing because the UK has just decided that anybody who gets less than a year in prison basically shouldn't go to prison. They should serve their sentence in the community.
Oh dear God,
Michael, it's so fascinating.
In our country, in the US, and prior to Trump, you had the same sort of thing from Republican governments, particularly about migration. The porous southern border with Mexico has been a big issue in American politics for almost as long as I can remember. We've had Republican governments, we've had Democratic governments, and it was always talked about as a problem that's too complex to solve. Donald Trump comes to power in 2016, and he began to remake the Republican Party. When he comes back to power in 2024, boom, within a month, the border is secure. And now we're starting to deport people. What changed on the Republican side? How did Trump change the psychology of the Republicans to make the party less a party of stasis?
We have this massive bureaucratic apparatus, judges and administrators and just permanent Washington class who would say it's impossible to deport people, it's impossible to enforce our laws on this. And I perceive that people are not as neatly divided along party lines as you might think. I've encountered plenty of people in the United States who are not Republicans. They don't like Donald Trump, but they're tired of the unenforced immigration laws, and they're tired of the scale of migration. And while they might not vote for Trump, they're just they're firmly in the camp of people who want this to end. So I think it'll be important for Europe as well if Trump ends this conventional wisdom that nothing can be done. We can't deport. I'm hopeful for Poland and for other countries in this region before it gets too late that they will follow the Trumpian example and take action. And
I have heard a similar thing from European conservatives talking about why Trump, as much as the Europeans may bristle at some of his actions on tariffs and things like that, why they see him as a source of hope, at least, that something can be done about these big problems. I want to pivot a little bit, though, into what will happen if nothing is done. French President Emmanuel Macron recently issued a startling warning based on a French government report. He spoke of Islamist infiltration into state ministries and into institutions of society to turn France slowly by marching through the institutions towards Islamist government. And he said this is a big problem. What does the view look like from the UK? I mean, it's shocking to see on Twitter images of the new mayor of major cities in the UK who are not just Muslim, but like women wearing hijabs or men with the henna beards that indicate they are an extremist. Is there a danger of Islamists, not just Muslims, Islamists, infiltrating the system?
Well, I wasn't surprised at all by what Macron said. If you look at the evidence as to what's happening in the UK, we have a new sectarianism in British politics, whereby explicitly Islamist pro-Gaza candidates are being elected, not just locally, but into the House of Commons. We had 5 MPs at the last election who were elected on Islamist pro-Gaza lines. We have about 40% of British Muslims, according to good surveys, that say they want a Muslim-only political party. We have a very worrying new definition of Islamophobia being introduced by the Labour government, which is very clearly designed to limit the debate over Islam in 2 respects. The first, if you go back to the original definition, is if you discuss the rape gangs, the grooming gang scandal where Pakistani Muslim men were essentially sexually assaulting and raping white working class girls because they were white and non-Muslim. Talking about that, according to the original definition, would have been Islamophobic. And secondly, and more importantly in some ways, talking about the perceived demographic threat of the expansion of Muslim communities in Europe would now be considered Islamophobic. So, I would like to remind people that we still have a secondary school teacher in my country who is still in hiding because he showed a cartoon in a classroom that local Muslims found offensive, and he had to go into hiding, while at the same time Keir Starmer is telling J.D. Vance that no, we have no problem here with free speech, everything is fine. So yes, we do have an issue with segregation, with areas of Britain that are completely and wholly segregated. As Ed Hussein says in his book, Among the Mosques, there are parts of Britain where a young British Muslim can go their whole day from waking up to school to mosque to their local community, not having a single interaction with somebody from the non-Muslim majority. So you have that segregation with this political sectarianism and a sort of weakness, an inherent weakness among the political class to not only talk about it, which very few people are doing, but secondly, to actually do something about it. We have 85 Sharia courts in the UK. Those should be outlawed. We have cousin marriage. That should be, in my view, banned. We have Islamist associations with known links to the Labour government. Those organisations should be proscribed. And we should be as tough on anybody showing sympathy for Islamism as we are for people who might show sympathy for overt forms of racism, other forms of racism. So I think, the UK here has lost its way. Macron is right to call it out, but I don't expect any frontline politician in Britain to go anywhere near as far as Macron in being so honest about it.
What about the rest of Europe? This is not just a UK problem, or not just a French problem, it's happening all over. And yet the political class, the media class, the ruling class, the academics don't want to talk about it, and as Matt was just saying, even try to punish people who notice.
Well, I think it's, I was pleasantly surprised actually that this report was shown. And I think anybody who has common sense knows this and would know this 10 years ago. But I think even 2 or 3 years ago, it would have been unimaginable that a French politician would talk about this, especially in France, because I think in France, you really have this very strong idea that you're a French person if you speak French and say you're French. So, I mean, they have this very strong sense of being French is not some ethnic thing. They don't even, look at it in their census. So I think that's showing a general shift, and I'm kind of, in this sense, fairly optimistic. So I think in the rhetoric, there's been a huge shift in the past 10 years. You were talking about Germany. I mean, I'm not a German expert, so I would have to look at it. But at least in rhetoric, Merz is saying a lot of things. And now we're actually talking about things like potentially, having kind of a ban on family, how you call them?
Family reunification.
Chain migration, that sort of thing.
In Sweden, I just heard that they are thinking about stripping citizenship from dual citizens who are involved in major crime activities. So I think this is for the time being mostly rhetoric and not actual policies. But I think eventually this will turn, and we'll have to turn to politics, because I'm in a sense still very hopeful that we are living in democracies, and you cannot really govern without the consent of the people. You might do it for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, but eventually people will get fed up with you and will vote in somebody who will do their job. And I think, although for my taste it's slower than I would like, I was really hoping that, for example, Trump's election and how Trump starts these deportations and shows it that this is, if it's possible in America, it should be possible in, let's say, Germany or France or the UK. So I was hoping that this will have bigger ramifications. So far, I'm not necessarily seeing that as much as I would like, but I think there is a shift in a lot of these European countries, and it will happen. I really am fairly confident. It might be too late when it happens, but
I was just going to say, if you look at the Pew Research Center forecasts of Europe, take Sweden, right? By 2040 to 2050, Pew estimates Sweden will be somewhere around 32% Muslim. It's nearly a third. So what does a nation state even do at that point? Because it's not about spotting infiltration of institutions. That would suggest entire towns, communities, 1 or 2 cities will be majority Muslim at that point. So how are you then going to ensure that the things we value, individual rights, free speech, separation of church and state, rule of law, etc., can be maintained?
Well, I think that's why it's a very controversial topic, but the deportations are interesting as a concept, because that could help you. So a lot of these people are first-generation migrants. Some of them are not even citizens, or at least dual citizens. So it's something I think we have to think about, and it's going to be very controversial. But especially with those people who commit crimes, I think it's kind of permissible to look at if we want these people, if they are first-generation migrants. Do we want the people who are involved in crime, in terrorism? A lot of these people who went to fight for ISIS and others, I mean, do we want them as citizens? I mean, luckily we don't have. I mean, at least I don't know we have Hungarians like that, but I wouldn't be comfortable. And also, I think what was troubling, what Matt said about the housing policy. So I was just thinking that here in Hungary, the government is helping young people who, commit to have 2, 3, 4 kids to build homes, buy homes, which I think government. So they do, have these low subsidy loans and help these people to actually buy houses, build houses. While in the UK, they are actually helping the migrants to get houses and don't care about their citizens. So in my head, this is not negligence. This is actually helping this. So it's kind of, it made me think that perhaps it's not just, that they are not, strong enough. They just, are afraid what BBC will write about them. I mean, if they do these policies, they're showing me that actually they want this. They want migrants to be in the UK instead of helping their own people, which for me is like very twisted.
Yeah, and this is exactly what the Renaud Camus means by the Great Replacement. Renaud Camus, by the way, banned by the Starmer government from coming into the UK.
Not banned from appearing on my television show.
That's right,
which I insisted on happening, even if he did dial in remotely from his castle in France.
Good for you. But the Starmer government is letting in Julius Malema, the infamous black communist rabble-rousing politician in South Africa, who is famous in America now for his videos leading stadiums full of his supporters chanting, "Kill the Boer, kill white people." He's coming into Britain, I read.
That doesn't surprise me because, as we call Keir Starmer, two-tier Keir, whereby, there's one rule for somebody and another rule for somebody else. I mean, the case that really does shock me in the UK, which everybody is talking about, but Keir Starmer says he's not on top of the detail, is the case of Lucy Connolly, the woman who, after the Southport atrocities, tweeted that some anti-immigration views and was put into prison for the best part of 3 years. At the same time, members of the rape gangs got lower sentences, shorter sentences than Lucy Connolly did. But there's all kinds of examples I can point to in the UK of minorities being given preferential treatment or being given lenient sentences, being given things that are not being given to members of the white British majority. That two-tier legal judicial system, which is symbolised by this housing policy, is now so embedded in the UK that the end result of this, Rod, will not be, I don't think it will be conflict. The end result of this will be the social contract just gives way. If you have got enough money and you're entrepreneurial, you leave the UK, right? If you are young and you are British and you think, have you seen the social contract memes that have gone round with the 30-year-old graduate? He's at the centre of the diagram and all the arrows are pointing to the things that he's having to subsidise. The illegal migrant, the baby boomer pensioners that got the best of the housing growth and the housing market, and all. The social contract just won't work for these people. So they'll just say, you know what, I'm going to go to Dubai, I'm going to go to Italy, I'm going to go to Estonia, I'm going to go to Portugal, because the UK just isn't working for me anymore. The immigration figures were interesting. 78,000 Brits left last year. 78,000 left. No one's yet asked the question, where have those 78,000 Brits gone? I bet that would be an interesting thing to look at.
Something has got to give, though. A German I was talking to in Brussels said that on the streets of Germany now, German teenagers, are carrying knives, arming themselves because they're terrified that they will be stabbed by a migrant, and they have no faith anymore that the German police will protect them. At some point, something's got to give. And we've talked on this podcast before about Professor David Betts at King's College London's War Studies Department about his prediction that in the UK or France or somewhere in Europe, we face the possibility of a civil war, internecine conflict, violent conflict because of issues like this, because the leadership will not act or act swiftly enough.
Well, the last time I was in Hungary briefly, because I think the Hungarians watching this will find this amusing. In the UK, there is a view among the ruling class that, Hungary is this sort of outlier that is challenging the EU and is super conservative. And so the elite class in London are very suspicious of anything Hungary related. So I was in Hungary last year at a festival, and as I arrived back into London Luton Airport, and I just was reflecting on Twitter. I said, I've just left a country that's got control of its borders, stable, very aware of its history, identity, investing in its own people with the family policy. And I've just arrived in London Luton in the aftermath of Southport. People are rioting in the streets. There's police vans on fire. Immigration is out of control. And I just sort of pose this question of, here are two radically different experiments. Now, the UK is in chaos, utter chaos. The social contract completely broken down because the son of Rwandan migrants murdered 3 girls at a tailor dance class, and the state couldn't even be bothered to give people the truth about what had happened.
A Welshman, right?
Yeah, he was Welsh.
A nice boy from Cardiff.
Yeah.
And I then had a debate with Nick Robinson, who's a fairly famous broadcaster in the UK, about this, and he said, but you tweeted this thing from Hungary, and you implied that Hungary was sort of, superior to the UK. And I said, Nick, in terms of the social contract, I think it is.
Yeah, but Hungary has to be the scapegoat for liberal elites, not just in politics, but media and academia, to justify what they do or what they fail to do. I want to move to the question of institutional elites. In the US now, Donald Trump is going great guns at Harvard University, trying to punish it for its own policies, its refusal to back away from DEI, diversity, equity, and what is it?
Inclusion.
Inclusion. Thank you. These are Orwellian terms. And Trump, this is hugely controversial, but I think what Trump is doing is he understands that, perhaps at an intuitive level, that so many of these bad ideas that are wrecking the United States start in the universities, particularly the elite universities. And Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, all of them are so woke. And yet they produce and continue to produce the next generation of the American ruling classes. Is that something that Europeans should care about within their own countries? Because, as I love telling people, whenever I go to Oxford or Cambridge and talk to conservatives there, they will tell me that there's a reason why the British ruling class, whether they're Tory or Labour, are simply utterly disconnected from the rest of the country. They only govern and they understand the world from within their elite bubble. Is there a role to play for governments, democratically elected governments, in reforming these institutions that create the opinion makers?
Well, look, I'm the Hungarian, so I will jump in and I will say yes. But I think it's wrong to focus only on universities. So I think it's already too late. If a lot of these woke policies are being installed from kindergartens or nurseries to universities. So when the children go into universities, they're already full of these woke ideas because it's not starting there. So I think even if tomorrow you would get rid of all these universities, it wouldn't be enough because they started in kindergarten. A very obvious thing is, for example, climate change. I mean, I'm increasingly becoming a skeptic of climate change, I have to confess. But my generation, because we have been learning that from kindergarten, that that's a real thing. It's a huge thing. Even here in Hungary. But I mean, I think generally across kind of the Western world. So if I tell my kind of, my age group, even sometimes my own wife, they think I'm crazy because it's just so much in the kind of the way they were growing up. And now this is happening increasingly with some of the gender things, transgender issues. We all heard the stories of, the kind of queer days, or when you have transgender activists go in and read some things to the kids in kindergarten. So that's why Hungary introduced this child protection law, which was very controversial. But the whole idea was that sexuality shouldn't be in kindergartens or kind of lower primary schools.
What is the law? Help people understand.
The law, because they were saying this is banning gay propaganda, but it's banning gender propaganda, which is actually could be, straight or heterosexual.
And there's some gay people who are against this because Andrew Sullivan, the well-known British-American commentator who's gay, he believes that the trans madness is actually erasing gay people because they're convincing young men or women who might grow up to be gay that, oh, no, you need to change your gender, you're the opposite gender.
I think that happens, but also a lot of the kind of young children who just have depression or are unhappy with how they look. I mean, that's a very common thing when you're a teenager.
I'm 58 and I'm unhappy with how I look.
And a lot of these, so you had some controversial cases even here in Hungary where people were saying that I had depression, I had problems how I looked with, and I went to the psychologist and they basically pushed me towards the transgender route. And 5 years later I realized I was just unhappy with how I looked, but I wasn't like a woman in a man's body or vice versa. So I think it's a problem which opens up a bigger and bigger debate, not just education, but I mean what's going on in, let's say, the psychologist profession.
It's about institutions, isn't it? It's about how the institutional...
But also going back to the law, so I just want to emphasize that it's not against homosexuals. It's just, I mean, and you had cases in the Netherlands, other places, where actually they were showing programs to children, sometimes kindergarten children, about heterosexuals, about, how a man and a woman is having sex, or just showing naked pictures of a man and a woman. And I think that's up to the parents. It shouldn't be kindergartens or, primary schools to show that. I mean, you should have sex education when you're like 14. That's okay, but not when you're 8 years old. It's just confusing.
And we've seen across so many institutions in the United States, schools, including primary schools, educators think that they know better than parents, and we have seen them in recent years. This has been revealed. We have seen policies, official policies within school systems, saying that we don't have to tell the parents. We have to protect the children from the parents. Michael, do you think in the United States or in Europe, when you've been over here, do you see a problem with the institutions themselves being unresponsive or at least unaccountable to the rest of society? In other words, the universities, the schools, psychologists, a legal profession, and so forth, breaking the social contract.
Absolutely. We all remember our childhood more fondly than it probably was.
Not me. But carry on.
But I remember a time when we thought, okay, well, journalists lean a little bit left, but they're going to deliver the news, and if Bill Clinton acts up, they will cover it and they'll hold him accountable. And we all knew that the universities were a little bit crazy, and we thought that the corporate world was out to maximize profit. And now I have close to 2 decades of experience in the corporate world, and the LGBT and even pro-abortion propaganda in the corporate world is so tremendous. I guess I'm a little bit surprised now that a lot of people in society are just realizing how prevalent the DEI apparatus is. I
think a lot of normie Republicans still have this Reagan-era idea that big business is good. In fact, on a culture war level, big business is every bit as against you as the faculty of the English department at Harvard University.
Absolutely.
I was just going to throw in, the thing that has surprised me building on that is the extent to which the expert class no longer really appear all that interested at all in evidence and truth and information that challenges their ideology. So the thing for me around the gender ideology debate that I found fascinating, firstly, we had the Hilary Cass review, the Dr. Cass review in the UK, the most comprehensive review of gender medicine in the Western world, which concluded there was insufficient evidence to be manipulating children through these operations and pushing them down medical pathways. But secondly, we then had the UK Supreme Court judgment that said, shock horror, the definition of a woman should be based on biological sex, right? And that has now created the foundation for, single-sex rooms. But despite those judgments, the expert class in the universities, in the British Medical Association, in the National Health Service, have continued to insist that actually their ideology is what should be prioritised over science and over knowledge. So I don't think this is just about the institutions. This is a war over the Enlightenment values and the inheritance of the Enlightenment. Because, we have a ruling class that is very clearly willing to sacrifice our children and their health and their mental health, their physical health, on the altar of their ideological program. I found that the most disturbing aspect of the last 10 years. Even put COVID to one side, the extent to which the expert class are no longer interested in information that challenges them. And when that's presented, that's misinformation.
Now, we know that this happened in the Soviet Union, right? We all laugh at the Soviet Union about Lysenkoism when they tried to impose Stalin's Marxist views on agriculture. It failed. And yet it's happening here in a so-called liberal free societies.
Well, that you saw that on a micro level with the gender pronouns, where you were basically insisting that workers and employees buy into an ideological program on which there was minimal scientific evidence, but we all had to go along with it, changing our language, changing our way of life, changing the public space so that we can accommodate this radical ideology. I was in universities for 20 years, right? I saw this. My reading lists were decolonized. Speaker programs were vetted carefully as to whether people were conservative or gender critical. And what Trump is doing, I completely agree with, because we have a comparison in the UK. The University of Sussex, which treated a gender critical scholar named Kathleen Stock abysmally, harassed her, bullied her on campus.
She's a lesbian.
She's a lesbian. She's a gender critical scholar. She left her job because of the harassment. We've managed to get a free speech law in under the previous Conservative government that will now allow universities who violate free speech to be fined. The University of Sussex was just fined £600,000 for violating Kathleen Stock's free speech and free expression. So what Trump is doing in the US by saying, okay, if you're going to back all this wacky stuff, I'm going to take away federal funding. I say, great. In fact, what he said yesterday is I'm going to give the funding to trade schools. I'm going to take it away from Harvard and I'm going to give it to trade schools.
But you know what it is,
That's excellent.
It's that the liberals elites cannot bear the idea that they should be held accountable to the people who are funding them.
Exactly.
And I think this is one thing that's changing really quickly in our society. I mean, I'm the sort of person who, I was born in the late 60s, and I grew up with the idea, the very classical liberal idea, that universities should be left alone by the state. They play an important role. Their independence is necessary. But I've come to see over the past 20 or 30 years, universities have become the generators of some of the worst ideas that are taking away our liberties. Now, I don't think the state should control universities, but I do think that it's perfectly fair in a democracy for the elected leaders of the leaders elected by the people to hold these universities to account for the money that they're taking out of the pockets of taxpayers. Why is this such a radical idea? It is, though. We're coming to an end of today's conversation. I want to try to find some good news from you guys. Do you expect anything, or look, put your thinking caps on and think of something good that might happen, that might be unexpected but desirable over the summer in terms of European culture, politics, military strategy? What's something hopeful that could happen?
Well, for me, in terms of my country, England, Britain, the UK, the most hopeful thing is what we're seeing now in the national polling, which is the entire political system being reshaped so that a correction is unfolding, so that it's closer to voters on all of these issues we've been talking about. The British Tories are dead. Kemi Badenoch will be removed as leader. The Conservative Party is finished because it was no longer conservative. Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, not a perfect vessel by any means, but they have the biggest opportunity since the rise of the Labour Party in the early 20th century to now carve out a radical, bold, forward-looking policy agenda that will deal with a lot of the things that we've been talking about. And if they get that right, irrespective of whether or not they win the next election, they will change the national conversation.
Well, I mean, if I could wish for something, that would be peace in Ukraine. So that would be amazing if we could achieve something there, but I'm very kind of doubtful that will happen. I mean, I think, sadly, that's not really realistic, but that would be something which I think could help a lot of things go towards a better direction in Europe. But if I want to be kind of more realistic, I'm also kind of on Matt's side. I'm hoping that during the summer we will see a strengthening of some of these populist right-wing parties all across Europe. I'm really hopeful that for example, the Polish elections will go on the more populist route. I mean, I don't know, but I think it's close, and I think he has a good chance to win. And again, I'm just hopeful that in Austria, this terrible coalition of the three parties will just go away, and you will have snap elections, and the Freedom Party will win with a much bigger majority. So what I'm kind of hopeful of in a kind of a short term is that these populist right parties in Europe are becoming stronger, and hopefully this will lead to some concrete results.
From your lips to God's ears. Michael.
So I have two. Keep an eye on Slovakia. If you haven't been following Slovakia the last couple of years, it's a fascinating place politically, and I think it's going to continue to surprise us, and hopefully in a good way. Secondly, I predict that the Irish populist elements will start to become more cohesive. It's been a problem so far. People are upset about housing, about immigration, about young Irish people emigrating, and it has not manifested itself at the ballot box. We saw last year the establishment parties maintain their stranglehold over Irish government. So I know I can attest personally that there are people working hard on the ground in Ireland to make the people's frustrations more coherently reflected at the ballot box, and I think we'll see that this year.
Well, I'll tell you, my hope is not political. I'm going in a few days to France for the annual Paris to Chartres pilgrimage. Traditional Catholics have been doing this. It's a 3-day walking pilgrimage. They've been doing it for some years now, and it always concludes with a Latin Mass in the Chartres Cathedral. The French bishops hate it because they don't like the Latin Mass. It's to them a throwback to the bad old days, but it persists. This year, they're on the heels of an astonishing number of people going back to church during Lent and during at Easter in France. The Chartres pilgrimage, the website went down after the first 2 days of registration. So many people want to go. What I'm hoping for is that this pilgrimage this year will be the herald of a new rebirth of the Catholic faith in Europe and of Christianity in general. I'm not a Catholic myself. We have a new Pope now, Pope Leo, and the long, terrible reign of Francis the Merciful is over. We don't know yet where Leo is going to go, but it does seem like he's at least more reasonable. It's not trying to antagonize and persecute the traditionalists. So I can't wait to go to Chartres, to be there for this event. And I hope that we look back in history at the Chartres pilgrimage this year and the advent of Pope Leo as a time of rebirth for the Catholic Church. Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. I'm Dreher for View from the Danube.